Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Eastern Canadian. Today, we will talk about universal basic income, what it is, what it isn't. And to discuss it, we have Liam Wilkinson from the group UBI Works in Canada. Liam, welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
All right. So, we've heard multiple solutions to poverty, housing crisis, and big trouble of finding work in the current job market, for example, mostly in the COVID days, that's for sure. Uh, But the solution your organization is bringing to the table is quite particular. Let's define what, first of all, universal basic income is, what it isn't, and also if there's multiple types of UBI, I'm not certain, and how to implement it, like generally what it is.
Sure. At its core, as you correctly identified, there is a lot of things go by the name of UBI. There's a lot of acronyms out there in this space. Maybe your listeners have heard of things like guaranteed minimum income or guaranteed livable basic income or universal basic income or simply just basic income. And all these names all have a technical definition, or they all have a marketing definition to, kind of refer or highlight to something specific. But in general, in Canada, when we're talking about basic income, at its core, we're talking about an unconditional, regular cash payment directly to individuals. So these are the core components that everyone agrees on. This is where there is, almost complete consensus. So unconditional, meaning meaning there's no job requirements, there's no the government doesn't make you do anything. You don't have to enter a training program in order to qualify. You don't have to report every 2 weeks to a bureaucrat to
None of the
qualify.
usual employment insurance bureaucracy that we've all at one point had issues with.
Precisely so. There is no conditions. There's no external factors that are going to suddenly make it, next week you find out you no longer qualify because you failed some condition. So that's first and foremost. Second is regular. This is not a tax time thing that comes at the end of the year, that gives you a little one-time bonus. This is a regularly occurring payment, most often talked about in Canada monthly or biweekly. It's a cash payment. This is not a a tax credit. This is cash in your wallet. And finally, that it's paid to individuals. So this is not a benefit that goes to a family structure, that this goes to the individual members of that family. So that is what there is almost complete consensus on in Canada.
Would be what in Canada would be implemented if we were to consider it, basically.
Yes, and all the formal considerations by civil society, by political parties, including and in Parliament, all have this thing in common. Now, where there is a bunch of disagreement or difference in defining or marketing, so a lot of people have chosen different words to highlight, often comes with that U part of the UBI or universal basic income. It's the universal part. Now, there's two broad camps. There are people who use it to refer to universal eligibility, meaning that anyone who needs it gets it. So that's the same way that we talk about universal healthcare. Anyone who needs the healthcare gets the healthcare. It doesn't mean we all get cancer treatment. It means those who need cancer treatment get cancer treatment. The other way of talking about it, though, is universal delivery. Some people often, they'll say something like a true UBI or a real UBI, are referring to everyone gets the exact same amount. So that's a dividend idea. So an example of that is in Alaska, where every citizen gets a portion of the state's oil revenues. They all get the exact same amount. Doesn't matter if they're rich or they're poor, what their individual needs are, everyone gets a check. So that's another thing that is discussed. However, when people use UBI in Canada, they're almost always referring to that former example I gave, the universal eligibility. When you hear politicians talk about it, that's usually what they're talking about. But there is often a lot of confusion. And so I think it's always important when we're talking about it to specify. And for the purposes of this conversation, when I speak about UBI or basic income, I'm referring to that universal eligibility. So that means it's going to those who need it most, not necessarily everyone.
Yeah, I've seen multiple, like that's one that you were talking about, that even if if we give to everyone, then at tax time we kind of like adjust it at tax time or something like that. There was kind of discussions of that as well, and there's also the tax credit, which I don't think works quite as like efficaciously, if I can say it like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for instance, the Green Party of Canada, therefore a universal basic income. Their term for it is universal livable basic, or guaranteed livable basic income, excuse me. And what they say is everyone should get the same amount, just to simplify things. And then we'll use the fact that we have a progressive tax system to equalize things at the end of the year. But just for simplicity's sake, we're going to send everyone the same amount.
It makes sense to reduce bureaucracy to a minimum, because that's usually what like gets in the way of people. Like they don't even know if they'll be able to pay their rent at the end of the month because some bureaucrat in, I don't know, Moncton, Ottawa, depending on the center they work in, says that, oh, you don't meet this criteria, like you said at the start of the episode. Basically, we eliminate all of that. Everybody is taken care of, like the CERB a little bit. But at the end, we can equalize things on the next year to make sure that people that already make above 100,000, let's say, uh, don't just get free extra money, let's say.
Yeah, so a great way to put this is, we often, in Canada, we have a social safety net. The idea being if you fall down, there's something there to catch you. And a basic income is really a social safety floor, meaning no one falls through the cracks, no one falls through the holes in the net.
I hope there's a mattress, though.
Yeah, it's a bit of a crack if you fall too hard, but it's a floor, meaning that no one can fall beneath it. It's impossible. No one can slip through, and it's something that you can build on. It's really hard to build your life back onto a net, but a floor, something that you can absolutely count on, even if everything else goes wrong, even if God forbid, any of the horrendous circumstances we've experienced in the past 2 years reoccur, it's something there that you can 100% count on. And there's going to be no bureaucratic wrangling or surprises.
No, that's definitely what it sounds like. And the first thing that came to mind when I researched into it a little bit is there is kind of a stigma or even like a shame into like asking for help. And it seems like every program here in New Brunswick is kind of a little we have a specific case that our government's talking about. I'll just talk about it in a minute. But basically, like, you have to go through hoops, and those hoops can be it's basically like you're a circus animal jumping through hoops, and everybody around you, like, they might not understand the situation you're in, or like it's become such a complicated situation for no reason other than to just try to push some people back. To me, it's staggering.
Yeah, I've been engaged in this work for some time now, and I encounter that attitude all the time. It's really quite surprising, and it goes back to a lot of issues that, some of those issues can go back quite a long ways if you look at the history of where those attitudes originated from.
Yeah.
But in general, I think it's people who have never experienced poverty or struggled in poverty think that it is easy. There's a new study that's going to come out about basic income, and they asked a bunch of experts and social those who administer social services about their experience with this. And there was a quote in it that stuck with me, and someone said, one of the hardest jobs there is living in poverty. It is not easy to jump through all those hoops. It is not easy.
One of the first things I learned when I did one class of social work in university, and one of the things that stayed with me this whole time, people were asking, like, how do people, like, that live in the street, like, how do they get some help? But one person just said, well, just get them a check. I'm like, yeah, mail it to what address?
Exactly.
That stuck with me for at least 15 years now. Basically, it's like, yeah, what address do you send it to? They don't have a place to stay. They don't, like, it's such a complex issue, but if you treat it at the human level where everybody's treated the same and everybody deserves to not live like that, that floor becomes a very interesting idea, that's for sure.
Yeah, and you bring up an important thing. The factors that produce poverty are multifaceted. It is not as there is no panacea. There's no one solution that's going to fix all the issues related to poverty. It is complex, it is interrelated, and there's no silver bullet. However, the idea and guarantee to say that no one in our society, in a society as rich as this, should have to live below this certain level. No one should have to fall below this floor is, I agree, a very, very powerful idea. And I think one that can be a really effective center, a foundation for all the other social supports and services that we need to address these very complex issues.
For sure. And basically just starting from the point that nobody should live like this, but what do we do about it? Because I hear some opposition, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes there. But like they shoot down an idea and then they say, well, nothing will work. Well, we haven't tried anything else either. So how can you say that this idea is bad if we first of all haven't tried it, or you're not even willing to try something else? You know, that's
exactly. And while there are many complicated issues that and factors that produce poverty, that exacerbate poverty, that reinforce poverty, at the end of the day, poverty is just a lack of money. The difference
we attach
between
a lot of social meaning to it. I get what you mean, because we can see it as weak, we can see it as strong for some people because, oh, you're living through this, that means like you're strong because you're coming out of it, or but at the end of the day, poverty is lack of money to support what you need to live, period.
Precisely so. And so, it seems like a rather elegant solution if we're going to try to address that issue, to first try to, in addition, before we start tackling all the other things, to first address the money part of that.
I was going to give an example about New Brunswick. I might as well say it now before we move on. In New Brunswick, there's been talk from the minister, I do believe Minister of Social Development. I would have to check for that. He said that, starting soon, we will remove the requirements for, because when you're applying for either dental care and whatnot under social development, like when you cannot afford it, if you lived with a roommate, which today's rent costs are like out of control, so you kind of have to, if you had to apply for those, you had to give to the government your roommates basically financial sheet and their financial well-being to prove that you deserve it, even though you just have a roommate. That made absolutely zero sense, and the fact that it took decades to even remove this requirement is beyond me. So when we're talking about solution, yeah, you're just removing a hurdle, but there are probably many more hurdles that if I talk to people on the street, they could tell me about them. And I feel that at least, like, even if some people do not think that UBI is the exact correct way to go, at least it addresses those issues. Let's find solution that address those issues. And if UBI works, I'm saying, like, let's try it. Why not?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, that issue of the roommate, about who is in, a statistician or Stats Canada might refer to that as your economic family, who you're living with. And those kind of structural impediments are one of the reasons why a core element of a basic income is that it's paid to an individual, irrespective
Exactly
of who you're living with.
Now, about that requirement, though, a question comes to mind for children. Would that, like, I know it would be up to discussion because we would be implementing a system so we can make the rules as we go, but for children, do they get the money right away, or is it just for adults and then parents can invest the money for their children, or how would that go?
Well, I am not the only voice in this debate. So I will first say there's a lot of different opinions, but I can say that the movement as a whole has really kind of centered around this core idea that there are many things that we want to, that would be interesting to explore eventually, but what are the most pressing concerns? So in Canada, we already have a little bit of a basic income for children called the Canada Child Benefit. If you have children under 6, you might be getting a couple hundred or even in some cases a couple $1,000s a month. And we already have.
When I was young, my mom got $85 a month, maybe.
85. Well, it's gone up a little bit since then, but yeah. So we already have a little bit of a basic income for children, and it has been shown to so drastically reduce child poverty rates. We also have a basic income for seniors. We have the guaranteed income supplement that says no matter what you made during your working years or any of this stuff, if you're facing poverty as a senior, there is a program to guarantee you're not going to fall below this amount. Now, there are lots of questions about whether those are sufficient, and I believe that they could certainly be raised. But we already have a little bit on both ends of the spectrum. We have programs for children and programs for seniors, and in both of those programs we use the same model. We use a basic income model. But what's missing is something to fill in that giant gap in the middle of working age Canadians. What do they have?
We seem to treat, like, of course, like children, they can't work, and elderly people usually have more health issues and stuff. So of course, but at the same time, like, it's as if we're talking about working Canadians as none of them will get injured. None of them will have children. None of them will X, Y, and Z. I wouldn't say it's insulting per se, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood.
Well, it's certainly not realistic. It certainly doesn't reflect the realities of, working age Canadians. So, to your question, well, what about kids? Well, there are a lot of advocates who say that you should actually give a basic income to children, that some of it will be available to their parents, maybe some of it will be held in trust until they're of age and can use it to pursue an education, for instance, or that the amount is held in trust, and then when they go to enter the job market, that's currently actually being trialed in the UK at the moment,
Wales,
where indeed, where when people are exiting the when people are about to enter or university age, they get a basic income grant, which effectively enables them to start their working life on the right foot. So there are a lot of different ideas about how that could apply to children, but right now the primary focus is to fill in that gap. The primary focus of the movement of civil society in Canada is to provide a basic income to working age Canadians.
Makes sense. Now, if we try to look at dissenting opinions, we talked a little bit already, but there's some that we can, of course, ignore because it's just, I don't like it. People get free money, it's bad. But I mean, we can talk about actual dissenting opinions that, deserves to be talked about, things that we need to consider if we were to implement such a system. The idea that people might quit jobs or delay or stop looking for work if ever that arises. And I know from research, it's not exactly that complex, but that was in the 70s, so it could have changed as well. We're not sure. Do you have any other things that usually gets thrown at you in those types of interviews, or?
Oh, for sure. So I'll say first, I'm in the business of trying to make this happen. I'm in the business of political change. So I don't ignore those people who say, I just don't like it, because they'll vote against it. So, I feel that we need to convince enough of those people too. And we need to look at some of the sources of why people don't like it. Maybe people feel, I'll give an example. I used to work in Ontario advocating for a rise to the minimum wage. And what surprised me most was some of the people that advocated most voraciously against an increase to the minimum wage were people who were making just above the minimum wage, because they felt
it's peculiar,
that
isn't it?
it is. And if you delve into it, you see, well, those people often define themselves and their struggle by, well, at least I'm better off than this, or at least like my work is valued because this other work is valued less.
And that's something I've noticed as well. Like, basically, they would be better off with a system like this, but at the same time, they're just clinging to the idea that if I work 70 hours a week and make some overtime, then that means I'm superior to this status. Basically, it's so weird to me.
It is. Likewise, it's a bit odd to me, but at the same time, I can understand elements of that. I know those members in my own family who would say things like that, and I can certainly empathize with the need to define your struggle in a positive way. So I think to those people who have those things, you say, "Oh no, I just don't like it, giving people free money." I think it's actually incumbent upon us to demonstrate to them how basic income would improve their lives as well. Not
Absolutely.
just the lives of people who would themselves would get the benefit, but also the lives of their other community members. So that's absolutely something that that I focus on. I don't want to dismiss those.
Oh,
But
definitely. What I was more getting at is that, if we were looking at actual ideas that would be like inconvenience or
mhm.
something that's less advantageous with that system, like we can ignore like we can't ignore them as the human factor in all of this, but we can ignore the I don't like it. Like let's look at actual ideas what I meant, but I do get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Like we have to get everybody on board at some point.
And yeah, so of the policy critiques, if you'll let me call them those,
Yeah,
people who
exactly.
are giving those, there certainly are a few, and one, as you correctly identified, is, well, people will stop working. So that's a kind of an intuitive answer, that if you give people something for free, that they won't work for it. But it really falls apart when you interrogate it at all.
Hmm.
So, now we're having this conversation in 2022. We have the benefit of almost 6 decades of basic income studies, trials, experiments, pilots in Canada and around the world. And not only do we have all the primary evidence from the studies, we also now have meta studies of those studies. Okay,
That's
what
true.
is the overall impact?
Hmm.
And unambiguously, it has been found that there has no statistically significant reduction to work. Okay, when you look at things on the whole, there is no statistically significant reduction to work. And that kind of makes sense, because if you think about this issue in your own life, sometimes I ask those people who say, if we give it to those lazy bums, they'll just stop working. And I say, well, if I gave you a couple extra $100 a month, would you stop working? They go, no, 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 not me, other people. But then if you ask those other people, if I gave you a couple $100 a month, would you stop working? They say, no, 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 it's other people. So who are these other people? Well,
Hmm.
if there were so many people in our society that just wanted enough money just to get by, maybe they just wanted $18,000 just to get by, and they didn't want to work any more than that, then if you looked at the distribution of income, you would probably see a lot of people who only make $18,000, but we don't see that. Or you might see things like when people get raises that they would stop working or reduce their amount of working hours. We don't see that either, because it is not, we don't work just to survive. We work to improve our own circumstance, to better our
Exactly.
lives, to give ourselves more opportunity, to create a better future for our children. And none of those things go away just because you have access to free healthcare, or just because you have access to a pension when you retire, or
And
just because you have a basic income. The motive to improve doesn't go away. And so
mhm.
we have seen in Canada and around the world that people simply do not reduce their working hours.
And the
Now,
way I've seen it, from what I've like actually looked into, and it makes sense. Like the way I understand it is, it's either instead of fighting to basically get out of poverty and actually have an apartment, or actually be able to get a car to go to work, or actually getting X, Y, and Z that you need to live, food, heat, etc. You have all that covered for, and then you basically get to choose. Do you want to keep your beat up 93 Tercel, or do you want to move up to maybe a Honda Civic that would be a lot more efficient on gas, so you get to
yeah,
save a little bit? Do you want to have a better apartment or even own a house at some point? So like it changes from nothing to actually something better that you can actually thrive for,
mhm.
try to get. So I feel like it's actually an encouragement in a way, in my opinion. But is that what the research reflects as well?
Actually, yes. So not only do people, we actually find that people who are at the lowest end of the income spectrum, and this is seen in a lot of developing economies, that people actually increase their working hours than they receive a basic income. Well, what could explain that? Well, we find that when people have a little bit of security, first off, they're willing to take a little bit more risk. They're willing to hold out a little longer for that better job. They're willing to maybe spend that little extra bit on bus money to get to that job that pays a little bit more. But in our own economy here in Canada, what we've seen from the Ontario Basic Income Pilot is that people also seek better employment, of course, but that there are a whole bunch of people under the current system that have a disincentive to work. So the question,
Mhm.
will people stop working? When economists talk, if they get a basic income, when economists talk about that, they say, is there a disincentive to work? Does basic income prove a disincentive to work? And so the answer is no, that we've already seen, not really. But there's already huge disincentives to work built into our
Mhm.
system. So for
I
instance, there are people who are receiving benefits, but if they get a part-time job or they get a gig job, maybe they, want to make a few extra bucks doing some odd jobs,
They lose
suddenly
access.
then they get their entire benefits are lost.
Hmm.
So that is a huge disincentive. So
Yeah.
part of the rationale of a basic income is to say the thing that you're scared of, that people will start working, is the current case. So we need to do better than that. We need to improve that. We need to get rid of those disincentives. And a basic income guarantees that you always are going to get more money if you work. That is a primary feature, and that is not a feature of our current welfare supports. Many
Definitely not.
times, yeah,
Just an example from, I don't have a large circle of friends. I'm not exactly popular or anything, but just in my small circle of friends, two people, women in this case, had children, and they looked at the cost of kindergarten. They looked at the cost of getting to work and the salary they were getting at work, and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna stay at work at home, because paying for somebody to have my children like all day while I work is actually the basically my salary. So why would
exactly.
I go to work? This is
It's the
insane.
more financially prudent decision. So actually,
Exactly.
you bring up a great example. So before I said there's no statistically significant reduction to work when you look on the whole in aggregate, but a few people in developed economies do work less. They do. Some people in our society will reduce their hours, and there's really two categories. One is students, and the other
Mhm.
is new parents. And that should come as no surprise if you're trying to study to give yourself a better future. That if you can spend more time studying and less time working to pay for school, then you'll probably take that opportunity. But that's a good thing for society. We want students who can spend more time studying. That's why we provide so many incentives and grants and to students.
That's one
And
of the
the other,
first thing that came to mind for students. Like, it's such an important aspect that, you have to beg for student loans. You have to basically go try to get like funding. You have to get some kind of job on the side. You have to try to get people to give you bursaries and stuff. Like, if they didn't have to think about any of that, they could even just finance quickly their education and pay it back so easily, instead of coming out with 60,000 in debts. And like, it's a no-brainer from that perspective. It solves the problem
yeah,
literally.
and I agree with you completely, and I'll demonstrate a little bit of that. So the other example that I was going to raise was parents with small children.
Hmm.
So they also may choose to stay at home a little bit more for some of the reasons you talk about. Maybe childcare is simply too expensive. But again, it's a great thing for a society to have parents that are able to spend more time face to face with their own kids. It's a better thing for society to have, parents that can read more to their kids. In fact, and it leads to better economic outcomes down the line.
And the fact that we're
So
even talking about this is so depressing.
indeed, indeed, that it is not just completely obvious is indeed quite depressing. Um, but uh, yeah, so we there is for a few people there's some reduction in work, but down the line those things are economically productive. They're economically advantageous things.
And if it leads to like creation of jobs, we always talk about job creators. Mostly in the States, we're not quite that far down yet, but like, if we talk about job creators, people being able to start a business because they have a good idea that they can actually like help like Canadians to actually have a service that maybe wasn't there in the first place, or in a community that they didn't have that service in the first place. Wouldn't that strengthen communities, strengthen the economy as a whole?
For sure. And so, I think you bring up a great issue of starting businesses and things. And we have the story, the promise of our society is supposed to be that if you work hard, if you have a good idea, that you can make it. If you study hard in school, that you can make it. Um, But we know that that equality of opportunity just really doesn't exist. If your parents pay for school and you can spend all your time studying and getting good grades, that you're going to perform better than the kid who had to hold down 2 part-time jobs all through school. And we see that, even though these kids are just as smart and they attended the same university, one gets a better job in the end. Or we see that children born into households that are struggling, where both parents are working multiple jobs all the time and don't have as much face time with their parents, also have, lifelong lifelong differences as compared to their peers who had, a lot of attention from their parents. So these kind of differences manifest all over the place. And entrepreneurship, starting a business, is one of the huge ways. Most businesses don't turn a profit. Most new businesses don't turn a profit for months, if not years.
That's very
It takes
true.
a long time. So who is it in our society that can afford not to have an income for months or years? Well, it's not the poorest among us. It's not the majority of
Definitely.
Canadians. Most entrepreneurship is reserved for those who come from families and social systems that are able to support them, where they don't think that there's a big risk. Most small businesses, another reality is most small businesses fail. Most small businesses do not make it. Okay.
Very
And
true.
so we have to have a system if we want small businesses, if we want to support the few that will make it, if we want to support the few that will not just make it, but thrive and become large job creators and become the next Apple and become the next Google. If we want those conditions, we have to enable the conditions for people to take risks. And that includes a bunch of people allowing them to fail. So if failure at starting your small business means destitution, means you cannot afford to feed your family, then not a lot of people are going to open small businesses. And in fact, that's what we've seen in the recent years. We've seen the rates of small business openings is dropping precipitously. So one of the great arguments for basic income is as an innovation policy, is to enable anyone with a good idea and the drive to make it happen to actually have the means, and the economists would call that the risk tolerance. They can afford to take risks, is to provide everyone that opportunity, regardless of how rich your parents are.
Definitely a good point, because to start, you need that floor basically to be able to spring from. Like if you start with nothing and then you try the business and you cannot take being in the red for even a month or two, it's a rough path, that's for sure. And
Absolutely.
if we actually end the discussion on basically the third biggest question here, how do we pay for it? Now that's one that the news networks have had a lot of fun with, being like, how do we pay for this? It's unaffordable. Look at the tagline. I do believe that let me check here. The Parliament Budget Office said that it would cost 85 billion for 1 year for a federal program. Now that might be like the first year to implement it, and then it could possibly go down a little bit, but it's a big price tag. Like, is there like solutions to be able to kind of counter that, or?
Absolutely. So, the first thing to acknowledge is that the price tag is big. And personally, I feel that when we talk to people about it, we shouldn't skirt around the truth, but just like other big investments, it pays off. Just like investments into healthcare, they pay off. Just like massive investments into education, they pay off. Massive investments into infrastructure, they pay off. This is, in my view, basic income is best seen as a form of social and economic infrastructure. Okay, it enables those job creators and businesses to thrive. It enables people to take risks, to go back to school, to hold out for better jobs. It enables all those things. So I want to break down the figure, though. You're right. So it's around 85 billion is going to be the gross cost. Now, in the same report, the PBO also identifies around $30 billion worth of existing income supports that would likely be rolled into a basic income.
Just
Right?
federally, or?
federally and provincially,
Okay. Because
but
I've
only,
seen tax credits, some EI, welfare, and social assistance that could be rolled into
yeah.
UBI.
So the Parliamentary Budget Office has put out maybe 3 or 4 different versions of this, with different assumptions. So they did one in the middle of the pandemic. They did one with different rates of clawback. It's called, so different versions of a basic income program. They did one with different assumptions based on only federal or versus what the provinces could contribute. But the latest figure is it would cost around $85 billion. And the programs that you could roll in, so income supports that you could amalgamate, money that we're already spending trying to deliver cash supports to people, could be rolled into the basic income, and that would reduce the overall cost to around $51 billion. Okay, so now we're talking about a net cost of $51 billion. However, what the question, if we're going to make such a massive investment, is well, how much does not doing anything cost?
Yeah.
What's the opportunity cost? And Food Banks Canada has tried to do that estimation. How much does poverty cost us? And they put that number at around $81 billion every year. They think that that people living in poverty cost our society $81 billion. Well, how? Well, we know that, for instance, there's a lot of homeless people wind up in hospital beds. And hospital beds are very, very expensive. They cost taxpayers a lot of money. We know that a lot of people living in poverty end up in our criminal justice system. Our criminal justice system, enforcement, prosecution, defense,
just
cost
the
to courts.
the RCMP being called because some panhandler is at a corner and it doesn't look good in front of their business.
Precisely
Like,
so.
That's just absurd, but it is what's happening. The RCMP is being called, they have to dispatch. That's still a cost added, like across the country.
And who's paying for that? So a question could be asked: how much, if the RCMP officer got dispatched, maybe they're riding with a partner, maybe not. They're going to that location of the panhandler, then they're reporting back, they're doing the interaction. Maybe that's an hour's worth of their salary. Okay,
and also they leave the car running sometimes, and gas is so expensive. I have to mention it. The gas is so expensive. Like, we're a news show, so I have to say it. Gas is so expensive.
Indeed. The cost of living is quite high.
Yeah.
So we can ask ourselves, okay, so if we're already spending the money on poverty, on issues related to poverty, why wouldn't we spend the money, instead of trying to treat the symptoms, why wouldn't we try and treat the problem, treat the disease itself? Why wouldn't we spend the money trying to solve the issue that's causing all these issues? And so a lot of people said, well, actually, basic income would save in the long run. It would save taxpayers money. It's a big upfront cost, sure, but just like preventative healthcare saves us money in the long run, so too does preventative economic care save us money in the long run, right? It is cheaper to buy a toothbrush and brush your teeth every day than it is to get dentures when you're older, or root canals, or cavity replacement, right? Prevention is cost less. So that's an important issue. Now, regardless, though, there is still, so then you ask, okay, well, there's still an upfront cost, though. So how are we going to pay that? That's an entirely legitimate question. And I think we absolutely need to focus on that. So there's a couple of different ways that are talked about. Okay. For instance, if something you're doing is an investment, it makes sense to take out a loan. So if you are going to build a bridge, if you're a government and you're going to build a bridge, you don't you don't raise all the money to build the bridge in tax dollars. You borrow some of it. Why? Because, well, in the long run, the bridge is going to make you more money than it costs to pay off the loan. So why wouldn't you use a loan? If you're a small business, you get a small business loan, or because your business is going to make more money in the long term than the loan is going to cost you. So it makes economic sense. Now, and so if a basic income is going to save us and make us money in the long term by having a more productive and a richer economy, and by saving taxpayers the costs of poverty, then it might make sense. Now, personally, I think that's a very interesting argument, and one that economists and bankers have told us. Why would you even bother trying to raise taxes to do this if it's going to save money in the long run? I think, however, that how to pay for it is not an economic question. The reality is it's a political question. And I believe it'd be very hard to convince Canadians that it is worth borrowing money in order to provide the upfront costs for this program.
Very true. And
very true.
One thing that I do want to bring, though, there's been talks in the States from what I can see, that if automation is basically replacing jobs faster than sending them overseas actually is, which is a fact at this point, like if the people are able to get their products somewhere because of our publicly funded roads, they're able to have some employees, because you still need employees to run the machines. You get those employees that were formed in Canadian universities, colleges, like that were paid with public funds most often. Like if you're using all of these and also your employees get healthcare because of the provincial healthcare system wherever you are. If you get to use all of these and then you automate and you still get to use everything that's been publicly funded in Canada, why wouldn't you pay a bit more if you're not bringing anything for workers like you used to? For example, if a company starts automating everything and firing their employees, like there has to be some kind of balance, because the social contract here was you pay taxes and you also employ people and you get to use everything in our society that will allow you to send your products places, to get your products transformed, or even just like Canada Post, to be able to send your product somewhere. Isn't that like the social contract we should be talking about, that basically they're kind of removing themselves in a kind of nefarious way, where they don't have to basically produce as much for the society, but the society still produces a lot for them?
I couldn't agree more. And I think all of those areas that you mentioned are great examples. I would add to that the internet infrastructure. How many internet billionaires do we have now? And keep in mind that so much of the infrastructure for the internet, the protocols that underlie it, the physical infrastructure that enables it, is paid for with public funds.
The security that's built in as well.
Exactly. So yes, I do believe more. I do believe that a basic income, that we have more than enough capacity to pay. There is more than enough of a profit out there being made, wealth being generated, that we can use it to pay for a basic income. But like I said before, it's a political question. So I would refine your question, not just how can we pay for it, but how can we convince Canadians that we should pay for it?
That the investment is actually worth it in the short term, medium term, and long term.
Precisely so, because we vote, a lot of the benefits will take a time to manifest, and we have a short election cycle. 4 years goes by very quick in the mind of a voter. So the question, how do we convince Canadians? Where can we get the money to pay for it in the short term? People are very scared of debt, and that's, I think, a legitimate fear, and we don't want to underpin such a big investment on debt.
I
completely agree. So where then? So my organization, UBI Works, has actually been trying to answer this precise question. A lot of people have put out a lot of good and detailed plans about how to pay for basic income, about different areas that you could go to. But we also tried to tackle this question. And we set ourselves some important criteria, okay? We said, how could you pay for a basic income if first you didn't ask people who are making less than 100K, that's 91% of Canadians, or even less than $150,000, that's 97% of Canadians. How do you make sure they're not paying more? Because if you look at the polling data, 2 out of 3 Canadians support basic income, but 2 out of 3 Canadians don't want to see their taxes rise to pay for it. Okay, so we have to be sensitive to this political reality.
Of course.
So the first, when we think that one of the important things is we should be able to tell our fellow Canadians, listen, we can do this and it's not going to cost you more. We also want to make sure that we don't just pillage private investments
No, of course.
and private capital. We still need to have an area where businesses aren't going to flee, where it still makes sense to invest in this country. So, we want to make sure that it doesn't hinder our economic growth. The where the cure causes more pain than the disease. Of course not.
Yeah, and basically, I was pretty staunch there about the point I was making, but at the same time, I'm not saying tax them 90% like they were in the 30s or the 20s.
Exactly. So there's always, policy is always going to be an exercise in balance. And so the last criteria that we set ourselves was it's feasible. So, a lot of interesting tax proposals like charging companies for use of the internet or instituting wealth taxes or things like that are all very interesting ideas. Well, we don't know for sure that they work. They haven't been tested yet. Yeah. Maybe they will be. Maybe they're ideas that are worth pursuing. But I think that the need for basic income is so great that we don't want how you pay for it to be a bigger distraction to people to electors, to voters than the program itself, right? So we want things that we know for sure that they work. Listen, we're not going to try out some brand new thing. Either they exist in the Canadian tax code already, we're just going to tweak the amounts a little bit, or our friends in the UK or France or the United States have tried these taxes and they work too. Mm-hmm. So on our website, we recently published this plan, ubiworks.ca/how to pay.
Oh, here comes the plug. Here comes the plug.
Here's the plug. You ready for it? Yeah. Where we say we have a plan and you can go over the spreadsheets yourself, where we say you can basically recover the upfront costs of a basic income by seeking more contributions from the financial sector, minimizing the amount of tax breaks that the largest companies enjoy, and allowing fewer subsidies for the wealthiest Canadians. So I'll break these down if you'll let me. First off, the financial sector. When you mentioned people that are benefiting from the work of Canadians or benefiting from automation but not returning it. It used to be that banks employed a lot of people, a lot of good paying jobs, right? Most banking is done by computers now. But banks are still recording record profits. Right, so, you mentioned that social contract. So they're absolutely first, and banks and other financial institutions don't face the same tax regimes as other businesses. They don't have to pay the same tax rates as other businesses.
It's like they're full of like economics, really strong people that know how to deal with those things. So much
precisely so. They also have, some very, very strong lobbies in this country. Mm-hmm. They know how to make a good deal and to sound very convincing when they present it. So one of the first places we go to ask for higher contributions is from them, because, by the way, it is bank profits. We talked about the rising cost of living, the fact that the cost of housing is going up, gas is going up. These changes, inflation benefits asset holders, mm-hmm. and banks are by far the largest asset holders. So they are getting revenue from the thing that is making the cost of living harder for most Canadians. So we think that if we're going to try and address some of this, we should give them the opportunity to, because they're making profit on the very trends that are making life harder for Canadians, we should give them the opportunity to contribute to offsetting some of the worst excesses of that trend.
Well, so just as a side note here, banks and also credit unions used to be a lot more friendly to their customers and whatnot. Like, for example, like a simple savings account would give you like somewhere 2-3% or something like that, like 30 years ago, where people could actually put their money in a savings account, a normal one, not registered or anything, and actually be able to afford certain purchases. Credit unions had a lot more dividends, but it seems like that hunt for profit has kind of reduced those to such a minimum that I'm not saying we're being robbed here, but at the same time, we're like, they're not giving as much as they used to, as if they're like in a position where they don't need our favorable opinion or something like that. So I
Well,
think that's something to take into account as well.
I will say this. You know who proportionally pays the highest banking fees? It's the poorest Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
Proportionally, they spend more of their income paying banking fees, overdraft fees, just the account
Oh yeah.
fees.
Here's
Then
money. You have to pay us more money because you didn't have enough money. You're welcome, by the way.
exactly. So I certainly think if that is that business model can afford to use some interesting levies that have been used around the world quite successfully, like a financial transaction tax, like a financial activities tax. That can be used to pay for basic income. So that's number one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we can go to the financial institution. The second is we have enormous tax breaks for large companies. For instance, multinationals who are doing business in Canada don't need to pay the same tax rate as Canadian companies. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge one that we can immediately say, okay, well, that's unfair. We're giving we're giving these foreign companies an advantage, a tax advantage to doing business in Canada than our local companies. Okay, so that we could get rid of that. That could be used to get some more tax revenue. We could look at the things like our largest carbon emitters don't have to pay the full carbon tax rate, where else small businesses do. Okay, that also doesn't make sense. So there are plenty of different ways where we can look at the tax breaks on the books for some of the largest companies and say, we could repeal some of those, and that extra revenue could be used to fund a basic income. And the last is fewer subsidies for the wealthiest. Look at something like the RRSP, the Registered Retirement Savings Fund,
Mm-hmm.
right? Here, this is a program that costs taxpayers billions and billions of dollars a year. Okay, and that would be a good thing, because if it costs us money, but it also encourages people to have some savings when they retire, that could be a good investment. But we actually find that the vast majority of the cost of the program is actually because of its use by the top 5% of Canadians. Okay, so the most of the cost that we're all bearing in missed tax revenue is being the benefits of that are being enjoyed by the people who don't need help saving for retirement. They already have enough money to save for retirement, but they're getting the most benefit out of the system. So, there are plenty of ways we can look at the subsidies that are already out there and say, we don't need to apply that to everyone. And so we can pay for basic income with these three things without doing the things that are political suicide. No party is going to say, listen, we're for a basic income and we're going to raise everyone's income taxes to pay for it. No political party is going to say, we're for a basic income and we're going to borrow $80 billion to pay for it. They wouldn't get elected. So we have to think, what are the types of funding mechanisms that can pay and will get political support? We have on our website, ubiworks.ca, our idea about how that could be done, but there are plenty. It is not exhaustive by any means. There is a lot of good plans out there. There's a lot of good proposals for how to fund basic income.
And we could go on for a long time. I'm just thinking about the financial speculation tax and many others that are basically things that are getting, let's not say a free ride, but pretty close to that. But to finish this discussion, I'd like to just bring the idea of, let's bring this idea to people and what it would change in their personal lives. Because it's like me and you were talking about a concept, we're talking about how to apply it, and this is all important to talk about. But the people on the ground, I think, would just benefit from knowing what it would change personally or in their community. I'd like to call it dare to dream about it. For example, graduates, they just graduated, they want to get experience in their field. They could volunteer, they could try to get a job that's less well paid instead of going to work for a place where they'll feel a little stuck that they cannot work in what they're doing. Taking care of loved ones. Right now, we have to apply for employment insurance, wait for an answer, and they probably have to get some kind of paperwork to see that your aunt is really sick. Like being able to just take care of your family without having to ask permission to anyone. Look, my like you just do it, and the money's coming in to make sure you don't like end up in the street for taking care of your grandmother. And many, many more examples that would touch people personally. I think that might be like what needs to be done to actually bring this to a personal level where people get involved and actually like, yeah, that makes sense. And of course, bringing the how to pay for it as well on the side. But I feel like if they get personally involved, that might actually like you guys are probably already looking into this. Like I'm explaining how to sell the idea that your organization's
No,
for. But I feel like this is very important to be able to have a successful idea like actually sprout.
absolutely. I mean, people don't vote for policy, you know?
Mhm.
People vote for the feelings that are evoked when the promise of a better life is presented to them. And so for me, basic income, one of the fundamental benefits of it is that it emancipates us. It's a form of freedom. It is the freedom to say no to a shitty job. It is the freedom to relocate to a safer community. It is the freedom to, as you said, spend more time and caring for your family. It is the freedom to afford to be able to volunteer and
Mhm.
engage with your community or pursue artistic pursuits. You know, it enables people real choice.
And we haven't even talked about like one thing that I read because I do read a little bit to kind of familiarize myself before doing this kind of interview, but like the freedom, like it was one of the major points that really stuck with me. The idea that people, like mostly women, of course, that are stuck in abusive relationships, often they don't have any resources to themselves to be able to get out of it, to be able to actually get to safety. And there's a lot of like programs locally, but sometimes, like, how am I going to survive? I have no money. Being able to have that liberty to be able to get out of such situations, I feel like to me, like out of everything we've seen today, that's very important. This one stuck with me, and it would actually help a lot where it needs to be without having to target funds or anything, without having to create new programs. I think it deserves to be mentioned.
I couldn't agree more. The, you know, I, real choice requires, or power requires choice. That's what it means, the ability to choose between one thing and the other. So, we know the the realities of domestic abuse and the incredibly heart-wrenching choices that are placed in front of predominantly women trying to get out of those circumstances. I think the number one cause is the number one restriction is money. You know, taking your kids on the street or in an unsafe shelter or staying in an unsafe home environment is not a real choice. So providing real choice, I think, is what I mean when I talk about freedom. Because
Definitely. Money
those
means
who
safety as well.
the,
Like I think we forget it as well. Like we want to say that there's this saying that says like, oh, money doesn't buy happiness. Yeah, but it can actually lift you into a situation where you don't have to fear for your safety, where you don't have to fear if you're going to even be able to eat tomorrow, to be able to actually work on yourself. Like it's all interconnected with money. That's what our society is right now. And to pretend like it doesn't help, I feel is counterproductive, but that's another discussion.
This recalled to my mind a study which showed that people who are facing financial strife and poverty have a lower functional IQ than people who are not. Now, I want to give a fair warning about that statement.
Yeah, exhaustion is what comes to mind for me.
Exactly. When you are worrying about whether or not you can feed your family tonight, you can't think long term. Your body is physically coursing with cortisol and stress hormones. You're overwhelmed. You can't make good long-term decisions. You can't give things the time that they are due, the careful consideration. You're in fight or flight mode, and your body is designed not to think about things carefully, but to act quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and that takes its toll. The number one source of stress on people is financial stress. The number one source on relationships is financial stress. The number one issue when we look at in all sorts of domestic cases are those relating from finances. So, I would also not underestimate the impacts of relieving that collective burden off of the shoulders of Canadians, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if we did that in 40 years' time, we found that cancer rates fell because suddenly people are walking around a hell of a lot less stressed. One of the non-intuitive findings of basic income studies is we find that people smoke and drink less.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that counterintuitive. A lot of people would think for addictive substances that when you have more means, you would use them more. But no, people use them less. Well, why is that? Well, people are less stressed.
Stress goes down.
People are able to think long term. People are able to invest in themselves. If I'm worried about whether or not I can put food on the table, I'm really not worried about whether or not I'm going to get lung cancer in 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And exercise brings a lot. Like, I know it's completely irrelevant almost to the discussion, but exercise does bring down cancer rates, which means that if you have more time or more freedom to be able to do exercise in the times that you want, that's also like a reduction right there as well. So
the number one predictor of health outcomes, of how healthy people are, the number one predictor is how much money they have.
Mm-hmm.
When you are poor, you can't, you know how much good fruits and vegetables cost?
That's another thing, yeah.
4 times as much as a box of KD, 4 times as much as empty carbs and sodium, and that's why we see that that rates of so many diseases, of heart attacks, of strokes, of cardiovascular, of all sorts of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, are all concentrated among those in poverty. And so, and let's keep in mind that also costs us all in the end. Yes. We have a system of universal healthcare. We're all paying for those costs in the end. So, again, it's better to treat the disease than the symptoms. And in this case, I really believe that the disease is poverty. And, so if you asked, what it would be, what is the dream? Imagine yourself in your community. If everyone who needed if everyone in your community could afford what they needed to get by, how would that change the dynamic when you walk down the street? If everyone in your community could afford to pursue their own highest potential, was told, listen, not just empty words, you can do whatever you want, you can start a business. No, you actually the opportunity to do so. What would it look like if all the people in your life who are artistically inclined but could never make a living pursuing art could? What if people who want to get active in their community but just don't have the energy for it at the end of a long day? What would happen to our politics if people could pay attention to what's going on in their local communities, could pay attention to what their local politicians are up to? And not just those who can afford to buy their attention and scrutinize them and pay for lobbyists and whatnot. I think that again, I want to reiterate, basic income doesn't solve these issues, doesn't solve housing. It doesn't, once and for all solve poverty. But there's not a single issue that I can think of that it doesn't make better.
But it doesn't at least kickstart the process,
Exactly.
And I think with all the negative we've talked about, at least there's that little glimmer of hope Uh, uh, Liam Wilkinson, thank you very much for being part of the podcast. Do you have anything you want to address freely at the end?
Well, I would say, listen, if you are inspired to get involved by any of this, that know that there are, UBI Works, my organization, and our allies in BC, in Atlantic Canada, in Quebec, are quite active, where there is always going to be a home for you. I would encourage you to look at our website, ubiworks.ca, or basicincomenow.ca, which is a group that represents all the different organizations across the country, and get involved. The only way we're going to make this brighter dream come true is if we fight for it. And we're doing that right now. We could use your support. We could use your efforts, your goodwill, your volunteer hours. And I fundamentally believe that together we can get it done.
Well said. Thank you very much. And this concludes our episode of the Eastern Canadian. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time.